One of the great things I've said about working at Microsoft is there's anywhere from 1 to 7 different ways to do everything. Well, one of the bad things is there's anywhere from 1 to 7 different ways to do anything. So which one do I pick? My name is Bob Tickleman, and I'm excited to be your guide for this module on the various ways in which we can interact and manage all the resources inside of Azure. Let's get into this. So we're going to look at the various different ways to interact with the portal through the graphical interface, as well as command lines from CLI, PowerShell. We're going to take a look at deploying templates using the ARM template, as well as a new one, not listed here, called Bicep. So let's get into this. When you take a look at Azure, and I've done this in a previous recording, we've taken a look at what Azure looks like from an overlay of the operating system itself. So let's go take a look at that now. So what you're seeing is this hierarchical structure of the operating system of Azure. You're seeing this ARM layer, the Azure Resource Manager, which is the graphical and resource access point to everything inside of Azure. Now you can access it, as we have throughout these exercises, through the graphical portal. One of the problems with the graphical interface is it changes on a relatively frequent basis. Things are moved around, and I wouldn't recommend it as the method to do it. It's a great way to demonstrate the product, but our recommendation is to use some line of command line or some form of template-based deployment. And you're seeing we're going to take a look at templates, PowerShell, CLI, and the SDKs that you can interact with these resources. Each one of them is going to then commonly access a set of the resource providers. So however you do this, it doesn't matter. And in fact, this is the foundation of another recording we did earlier on policies, because all of this infrastructure is going to be represented in a JSON document. You'll see the JSON format specifically when we get into the templates. The structure of that information is going to be represented as defining the resource itself. I'm going to go into an exercise later where I'm going to create something graphically. I'm going to then export that as a JSON template. I'm going to modify that template and deploy it as a CLI, as a bash command, and then we're going to see how we can convert that into this new format of a Bicep form. Now, this Bicep is a relatively new language for many of you, and it's based around a more efficient way to use and deploy resources in Azure. Now, playing on that ARM term, or the Azure Resource Manager, if you think about your arm itself and you want to be able to flex it, you then flex your bicep muscle, and that's actually where the name came from. Is we're going to take a look at this new coding language, Bicep, that is a more efficient way to then work with what you would have done from JSON. So let's go in and take a look at this. I've done this in other recordings where I actually jumped out and used Copilot as a tool to then understand nuances and ways to do things inside of Azure. Actually, we've built Copilot into a number of the tools that you're working with, and I would strongly recommend that you find ways to use Copilot as a way to work with your infrastructure. Now, more specifically, when you're trying to write templates, and I'm going to show you a thing called the Microsoft Quick Start Template Library, which are small templates that are pre-approved and written by Microsoft to do certain activities. Now, if you're not a developer, you might take a look at some of those and find it, challenging to start to understand what's in them. But I would strongly recommend using something like Copilot to actually take those templates that we've already built and then use them to be modified using Copilot to say, can you use this pre-built Microsoft template? Because maybe it doesn't do exactly what you want. You could then use something like Copilot to take that baseline template and modify it based around your natural language request to take that thing written by Microsoft for a specific activity and bend it to your will. And I've often said for a long time, I used to write these templates. I don't write them anymore. I plagiarize them. I go to existing templates and I find pieces from the ones that I like and then pull them together using Copilot, as opposed to having to write these templates from scratch. And again, when I get to the live demo, I'll be showing you the Quick Start library, and we maybe explore some of the ways to do this other than just deploying the template by itself. As I said, there's a variety of different ways. This is just a graphical look at what I was showing you on that slide. We've got everything from the portal, which changes frequently. We've got the CLI and the command line tools that are available to us that change relatively infrequently. So it's considerably different than the graphical portal. So when working with something like PowerShell, the command line infrastructure hasn't changed for over a decade. And one of the nice things is the templates that you've written will then stay consistent regardless of how attributes might have changed or the graphical portal might have represented those changes. The templates accessing the raw resources will stay the same and wouldn't need the modifications that you would have to have done if you were doing things in the graphical portal. We'll show you a couple of the tools in the graphical interface, things like Cloud Shell. You can use PowerShell on your own computer and make connections to it, or we'll take a look at the CLI commands within Cloud Shell itself. When you take a look at templates themselves, this is the coded infrastructure deployments. You might actually hear called IAC. IAC, or infrastructure as code, is going to be based around templates like this. And it's a great way to, at scale and consistently and repeatedly, be able to deploy resources. And so through a script that you could then deploy, you could have an entire solution built. And I'll do an example of that based on a resource group that has over 100 objects in it that I could export and then use that template as a starting point to deploy those 100 resources simply by deploying that one template. So a great scalable, consistent way. And in fact, what we've done for a number of customers is it's a way for us to recover their infrastructure very quickly, much more quickly than you could potentially with a backup and recovery. Now, I want to be a little bit careful. I'm not saying don't back up and recover your use it for recovery of your information. It is one way to deploy the infrastructure that you then might be able to recover maybe data files or specific resources you're working with. So in conjunction, it's a great way to work with these infrastructure by deploying them consistently and reliably using templates. Now there is a format. The ARM template itself is a JSON document that you would build, and we've got a sample, I'll show you them, that has a little over 1,200 sample deployments of Microsoft resources in Azure that you could then use. It follows a format that will consistently deploy these in what's called an immutable solution. So if you run the template a second time and the resources are already there, it doesn't modify them. It creates the same result. But if maybe you want to make a change, you add a line to the template, you redeploy it. It doesn't redeploy the entire resources. It adds the additional features to them. It's a great way to constantly evolve your solution by using these templates to keep that change control in place. You can also use it as a variable so that you can use the same template as opposed to deploying the same resources. You can have values that you could then put in to maybe use the same template to build a test environment, a development environment, and a production environment. And so using the same templates, you're going to make sure that you've got the same consistent deployment of those resources across those 3 different environments. So ARM templates are a great way and would be the recommended way to deploy your resources in Azure. Taking a look at that pattern, we saw that there's a schema or format using these values of what is the schema of the JSON document, what are the parameters, variables, functions, resources, and outputs. These become the 5 values or components that make up your template and make them, whether they're static, deploying the same resources, or do I have values that I could bring to say, I want to be able to deploy the same virtual machine, but maybe with a different name, or maybe to a different resource group. So you can have these different values you could put in to make them variables so that you can have them customized for a specific deployment. So taking a look at further into the parameters document, we'll see that when we get to the demonstration, there's the actual template itself, and then there's the parameters document. There's 2 components of it that then deploy the resources overall that you're working with. So you're seeing some of the parameters that you might want to have, and you'll see this come up in the graphical interface when I deploy it. You know, it's going to have a field for what is the username, and it's going to now allow you to put in a value that will then get plugged in for the username. I'm going to be doing a demonstration of the deployment of a virtual machine, and that virtual machine needs a user account and password that needs to go into the provisioning of that virtual machine. So you'll see in a few minutes, I'm going to go in, create a virtual machine in the graphical interface, providing all that information. I'm then going to export that template, and I'm going to then go into the template document, modifying some of these values, then running it again and leaving certain attributes allow me to then change them in the graphical interface. And so you'll see that deployed as a template, as a script, as well as a PowerShell and a Bash component that we're working with. And here's that new format. Now, as a general rule, if I were to compare two documents that are the same, and I'll do this in the demonstration, that we have a demo site that you could take a JSON document that might be 138 lines long. You then take that same deployment. It is a much simpler, lighter structured, easier to read document that deploys the exact same resources, and it's on average about 30% smaller and lighter for the deployment, makes it a little bit faster and easier to work with. So I would encourage you to now start looking at Bicep as the way to deploy your resources. And using Copilot, you don't have to learn how to write Bicep. You can take all of your existing JSON templates and then deploy them, or have Copilot rewrite them as a Bicep file. So let's go to the demonstration of these deployment styles. So I want to do a demonstration using PowerShell, which is one of the tools we talked about to be able to administer the Azure environment. You could use PowerShell on your local computer, but you'd have to download modules. I'm always a big fan of trying to use PowerShell because it's always current, it's always configured, the modules are always loaded there, and it gives me global capabilities that I could go to any computer on the planet. I could bring up a browser, I could log into the portal, and you'll see that as I get into this demonstration, I've got it so much that it's the first time I'm going to be going in on this client, so it's actually going to create a storage account. You'll see me do that as part of the demo, and in that storage account, then I can actually store files. I can have utilities and tools that are there that are going to be globally available to me, as I said, going to any part of the planet. I could open up a browser and then have that information there. So I'm going to go into this demo, and we're going to demonstrate doing it in the graphical interface. I'm then going to take the export of that information. So I'm going to create the object in the graphical interface. We're going to export those templates, and then I'm going to then import them and then modify them. And you're going to see I'm going to change the disk name. So I'm going to create a disk, a virtual disk. Graphically, I'm going to then take that virtual disk, export the templates and the parameters file. I'm going to import them to run it as a special template. So that's the second one, so that's going to be disk number 2. I'm then going to run it using PowerShell, and then I'm going to run it through the CLI, and then I'm going to do it through Bicep. So at the end of the day, we start with 0 drives, and you'll see me progress through this. We're going to go through and create 5 different drives in these 5 different methods. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create the disk graphically, and so I'm going to search for the disk capabilities. I'm going to create the disk itself. There's a few parameters that I'm going to add. We're going to have the subscription and the resource group. You can actually pick an existing one, or I'm going to create one here. So I'm going to create a resource group. And you have to give the disk a name, and I would suggest that you follow some naming convention. I'm going to pick the region I'm going to deploy it, and the kind of infrastructure. I'm going to go to no infrastructure. Just want to make this quick. And then I'm going to change the size of the drive itself. I'm going to change it from a default of a little over 1 terabyte. I'm going to change it just to 32 gigabytes just so you can change this. And I'll be making adjustments as I go into the template later. It goes through its validation check. I'm going to actually deploy this. It'll only just take a second to do this. Now let's go to the resource. So there's the disk. It's been created. So now I need to export this and the parameters and the template files. You'll see them come up here. Take a look at some of the values. You can see the size of the disk name. You can see that it was there, 32 gigabytes. So all the characteristics that we have, and here's the parameters file. And then I'll just download this to my local computer. So now I'm going to deploy this from a template. So I look for the deploy from template tool. Bring this up. And then I'm going to have to upload these files into the tool itself. So I'll deploy the template. I'm going to upload, go to the template file first. And I'm going to change the disk name to disk number 2. There's a couple of places I need to change that. You can see the rest of the values are there. And you can see it. The template looks graphical. I'm going to now upload the parameters file. Change that disk name. And so now, just as I did before, I have a graphical tool that has a bunch of the values already in there, and I'm going to deploy disk number 2. And so now I can see I have 2 disks. The first one I did graphically, the second I did through template. You can actually take a look at the deployments. Now this is me opening up PowerShell for the first time. I'm coming in, I'm going to pick a subscription. You can pick the storage account, the location. This is where you're going to be able to have a number of files. So I'm going to upload the files. So I'll load up the parameters file. The order that you do this doesn't really matter. So I've got the parameters file. I'll upload the template file. And you can see that I've gone into the editor. If I scroll down, make this a little bit bigger, you can see that that's the parameter in the JSON file. That's that storage account that I was taking a look at. And so I'm now going to go in and take a look at that disk 1, and I'm going to change the name. I'll save that. I want to deploy this in PowerShell, so I'm going to switch the interface to PowerShell. And there's the command to actually deploy the template using the specific template file and the parameters file. I'll execute this. Now, there's not a lot of information you're going to see interactively here. There are commands you can use in PowerShell, but you can see that it ran that tool, it created the disk. I'll refresh the screen. And so I've now created the 3rd disk. I'll do a PowerShell command just to list the disks that were created as well. And so you can see that I've got the 3 disks. Now I'm going to switch back into Bash, or the command line, or CLI. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to open up the editor here. I'm going to change the values in the template and the parameters file. Change this to disk 4. I'll save that. There's the command to execute it. It's successfully completed. You can see all the steps that went through to create it. And as I said, you could get some information as it's actually deploying on its status. I'm going to print off the list of the resources so you can see I now have 4 disks. I'll go back up into the graphical interface and refresh this. I've now created the 4th disk. Now I'm going to upload a bicep file. So I've already got this one created. And you'll see a significant difference in the format from JSON as well as the length of the file itself. So I'll make this a little bit bigger so you can see some of the file. But this is a bicep file that does a lot of the same infrastructure. As I said, it's a really great way and modern way to be able to deploy IAC, or infrastructure as code. And change to disk number 5. And change the size to 32. I don't think there's anything else that needs to be changed. Oh, I'm going to change the style of disk from an ultra disk to a locally redundant but standard. Let's change this. Just so you can see it's slightly different. You can make these edits. I'll deploy that file. There we go. I got the results. I can print out the table of the number of disks. We now have 5 disks. You can see that the change in the style of disk from the first ones were premium. I went to a standard, and I'll come back up and refresh this. So there's the example of using the different methods to be able to deploy resources inside of Azure, from the graphical interface through to template deployments. And I do want to show you that template library, the Azure Quick Start template library that's available. So just give you a hint here, putting Azure Quick Start template library :learn, it's going to focus that request going to the learn site to get this information. And it should bring you directly to the tutorial for the Quick Start template library. In here is the documentation for the entire Quick Start library. And clicking this link should bring you directly to the template library on the Microsoft site. And as I said, you can have a little over 1,200 different deployment templates that you could work with. Now there's different scenarios that you can search for, and while there may not be an exact match to what you're needing, you could use these as a sample that you could then edit yourself to make the modifications that you want to make for your deployments. So for example, if I wanted to deploy an N-tier architecture or a 3-tiered architecture for deploying a resource, you could do a search, and I've got different templates that might be a starting point. Now these are built and written by Microsoft, so they pass all sorts of credentials, and I would say that these are the recommended starting points. I think I mentioned in the lecture portion that I don't write code anymore, I plagiarize code. So what I'll do is, I'm very familiar with these template libraries and what they're available, and I'll use something like Copilot to say, Copilot, I need you to go to these 3 or 4 templates, so I'll give it the template names. I need you to pick out the resource deployments for the disks from this one. I need you to take out the Cosmos DB configuration from this one. I need you to put together, and oh, by the way, could you deploy that using Bicep? So I don't have to do all that work. I just have to know where the resources are, what I need from them, and I can do Copilot, or I can let Copilot do all that heavy lifting. So that's great. Let's go back to the lecture. So in this module, we covered a number of topics around the administration of the resources inside of Azure. We used the Azure Portal as a graphical tool to get in and manage resources. And remember that everything that you create in the graphical portal, or anyway, ends up representing that resource as a JSON document inside of Azure. So we created it graphically, we then took those JSON documents and we exported them. We then took those documents as a template file, and I also showed you that we had a library of templates that you could then use to redeploy the resources using the template deployment resource inside of Azure. Now, you could then take the CLI and the bash, and we could go to PowerShell, either one of those, 2 different methods, depending on the language that you like to work with. And we then took resources, edited the file, and then from a command line, we were able to deploy resources. And then we looked at the modern method of using the deployment as using the Bicep language to be able to deploy that infrastructure. So there are other tools that are out there. Companies have provided other capabilities and applications to manage resources in Azure, but this is the fundamental way that you might want to get in and manage it. Thanks for joining us for this session. To continue your learning, watch other videos in the course or explore more on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn.